Welcome everyone. In this tutorial, we're going to go over variables and assignments in Python. We're going to go over some notes, and then we're going to go over a bunch of examples using variables and assignments down here. And I think I'll put something in the tutorial description notes if you want to skip this section here and get right into the code. Okay? A quick definition. In computer programming, a variable is a storage location paired with an associated symbolic name or identifier that may or may not change. Think of it as a box you put stuff in. A few ways variables are useful include, but are not limited to, when you need to create a placeholder for some part of your program that you don't know the value for yet, or that will change. To give a name or characteristic to a part of your code for later reuse, and to assign code to a variable with shorter syntax for later reuse. Now let's go over some notes regarding variables and assignments. Variable scope and where a variable is used can determine how a variable is classified. So a few examples include local variables, global variables, instance variables, and class variables. Now let's go over some specifics for those types of variables. A variable only used in a function may be called a local variable because it is visible only to code inside that function. A variable with a larger scope may be called a global variable because it is visible or available for use throughout the entire specified file or location. So it has a larger scope. A variable used to store an instance or object data from a class may be called an instance variable, and we'll go over some examples of these instance and class variables a little bit later in our tutorial. A variable used to store data from a class that is the same for all instances of that class and often has a value assigned in the class may be called a class variable. Okay? Now, you don't need to declare a type for a variable. For instance, in other languages, you may be used to declaring a variable with its type, such as int, float, or string. Okay, so you don't need to do that in Python. All kinds of things can be assigned to variables, such as strings, numbers, functions, lists, dictionaries, tuples, and the list goes on, and we'll show you some examples of that once we get to our code. Note that certain reserved words, such as keywords, cannot be used as variable names. And if you're ever getting a funny error and your code won't run properly, one of the first things to check is to make sure that you're not using a reserved word as a variable name. And we'll just actually skip ahead to our last note here. Check out the Python PEP 8 style guide for Python code on the python.org website for additional information on variable naming conventions and style suggestions, because certain variable declarations are not allowed. So check out that PEP 8 style guide for further information on that. Remember that the single equals sign is for assignment and that the double equal sign is for equals. Okay? So when we assign a variable, we typically use this single equal sign. Python typically uses underscores to break up a variable to make it more readable if needed. However, you can use camel case, but the normal Python style is to use the underscores. So those are our notes, and now let's jump into our code examples. Okay, let's declare our first variable. And in this case, let's actually show you a way that you would not want to declare a variable. So let's say 2var equals string, and try and print this, 2var. And you can see we get an error. So that's an example of a way you would not want to declare a variable. And that goes back to what we said in our notes, that there's certain ways that you can declare variables that are not allowed, such as keywords or numbers in front, things like that. And I believe there's more information about that, as we mentioned in our notes, in the Python PEP 8 style guide. So check that out for further information. Now let's declare a variable in a way that would work. So we're going to go ahead and declare a string, and let's be explicit about what this is. So we'll say string, and we'll use an underscore greeting. Now if you wanted to use camel case, you could do this. However, typically in Python, instead of the camel case, you would want to use the underscore, but that's really just personal preference. So you could do either or. So let's say string greeting. And as we mentioned earlier, also you can use single quotes or double quotes. So you could do it like this, or you could do the single quotes. And we're going to do a concatenate here in just a minute. So I want a space between what we concatenate. So let's put a space and close our single quote. Okay, so that is a string greeting declaration. Now let's declare another variable, and we'll say this variable name is name. And let's put in a name in single quotes, Johnny Appleseed. Okay, so those are two examples of how you can declare a string variable. Now let's concatenate these, and to do that, let's just pull up a print. Let's put in our string greeting plus our name variable. Plus name. Let's go ahead and print this out in our IPython console, and we get hello Johnny Appleseed. Okay. Moving on, another note is that variables in Python are case sensitive. So a variable declaration like this is different than a variable declaration like this. Okay, so we have a var1, but this var1 has a capital letter, and those are actually treated differently. And we can show that by, again, pulling up a print. Let's put in our var1 and then our var1 with the capital, and you'll see that this var1 lowercase should print out a 5, and this var1 uppercase should print out a 10. Okay, and it does here. Now, our next example, let's do a calculation with variables. So in this case, let's just add these two variables together, and we should get 15, but let's just go ahead and do it and see what we get. var1 plus var1. I'm going to clear the console, and I'm just going to run this one line of code. In Spider, you can do that using function F9, and you can see lowercase var1 plus uppercase var1, we get 15. Now, if you want to declare a variable with decimals, that's often called a float, and you can simply do that by declaring your name. And let's declare a variable float of pi, 3.141593. Okay, so that's how you would declare a float variable. Now let's declare an int variable. And to do that, we just declare our name and the int. If you wanted to declare a bool variable, you can just create your name, and you could put in true, like that, or you could put in false. Okay? And there is a variable that you can assign none to. However, we're not going to cover that in this tutorial. We'll cover how that would be used in future tutorials, okay? Because it doesn't really apply in these cases that we're using so far. Now, it can be used, and there's differing opinions on how and when this should be used, but we'll show you some examples of the none type in future tutorials, okay? So now let's move on to a tuple variable assignment. And in this case, let's just create a variable name T1 and T2. And you could put that in parentheses if you'd like, but you don't have to. So let's just say T1 and T2 is equal to 0 and 1. So in this case, the T1 would be assigned to the 0, and the T2 would be assigned to the 1. And you can show that displayed. So let's pull up a print, and let's put in T1 and T2, and let's run that and see what we get. And we should get 0 and 1. And we do here. Okay? Now let's go over a list assignment with variables. And we haven't covered lists yet, but we'll get into the details of lists. So for now, just kind of pay attention to the assignment part and the variable part. So to declare a list, let's put this in square brackets and say sky and grass is equal to, again in square brackets, a string of blue and green. So what's happening here is we have two lists, and in this case, kind of similar to the tuple assignment, the sky would be assigned to the blue and the grass variable would be assigned to the green. And we can print this out to see what we get when we print out this list assignment with the variables sky and grass. And you may think of these as variables or you may not, but the end result is the same. We have a list assignment with a name assigned to a string. Okay, so let's print this out, and let's print sky and grass, and we should get back their strings, which would be blue and green. So let's run this, and we do. So we printed here sky and grass, and we got back the strings blue and green. Okay, let's go over another type of assignment called sequence assignment. Let's create our variables S1, S2, S3, S4, and we're going to assign this to a string of eggs. So what's happening here is these names or variables, however you want to think of them, S1 would be assigned to the first letter in the string E, S2 would be assigned to G, S3 would be assigned to the second G, and S4 would be assigned to the S. So if you actually print out all of these sequence names or variables, you should get the word eggs. So let's print out S1, S2, S3, and S4. Select it, F9 to run just that part. And you can see that we get eggs printed out, just like we said. Next is another form of assignment. We call this a form of sequence assignment unpacking. Okay, so in this case, let's create our names. S5. We're going to put a star, and I'll tell you what this does in just a second. S6, and let's use eggs again for our string. So what's happening here is the S5 is assigned to the first letter of the string E, and this star S6 picks up whatever else is left. So the S5 would be E, and the star S6 would be G, G, and S. So let's go ahead and display these just so we can see exactly what it's doing. S5. And now let's display the S6. Let's select that part, function F9 to run, and you can see for the print S5 we get E, and the print S6 we get the GGS in a list. And you could actually, I think you could put that star in there too and it will still work. Let's try it. Now in this case, it does still work, but notice there's a slight difference. When we print out just the S6, we get the remaining part of what's left in that string displayed in a list, and when we put the star in, we get the remaining part just returned back as a string, or I guess you could say not in a list. Okay? Next we have something called multiple target assignment, and this is where you can create names or variables, and each name or variable will return the same string or number or whatever you assign it to. Okay, so in this case we're going to say eggs equals bacon equals breakfast, because you can have both of these for breakfast. Now let's go ahead and print this out, and when we print out the names, eggs and bacon, they should both return breakfast. And they do. So we printed eggs and bacon, and we got breakfast, breakfast. Okay? Now, we'll try and show you some examples of more specifics of how these might be used in programs in future tutorials. Okay? For these next few examples, we're going to use some parts of the Python language that we haven't covered yet. However, no worries, because we'll go over anything we cover in detail in future tutorials. Next up, we have what some people call the augmented assignment. I like to think of it as a running total. Some example syntax of an augmented assignment is var plus equals some number, which is equivalent to var equals var plus some number. Let's create some code to show you how this works. var1 equals 0. We're going to create a for loop for I in range of 10 numbers. Use our var1 and the augmented assignment plus equals the I in the for loop, which iterates through the range of 10 numbers. Now let's use a print statement to display the iteration through the for loop, I and the var1. Select the code and run it, and you can see here in our left column we have the iteration through the range of 10 numbers starting at 0, and in the right column we have a running total. And you can see it's a running total if you start down here at the bottom with 45. That is the 9 plus all the numbers that come before it added together. The 36 is the 8 plus all the numbers that come before it added together. The 28 is the 7 plus all the numbers that come before it added together, and so on. Okay? And we also mentioned that var plus equals some number is equivalent to var equals var plus some number. So let's show you, if we change this syntax to var equals var1 plus I, this should return the same thing as this did. Here, let's go ahead and run it. And you can see that we get the same output and the same running total here and here. Next up, let's show you how to assign a function to a variable. Let's create our function that adds two numbers together. So we have a function declaration, starts with def, the function name add two. It takes two parameters or arguments and returns those two inputs, a plus b. So it adds two numbers together. Now we can create our variable. We'll call this add to var. Let's assign our add to function. And remember, you want to leave off the parens like this. Now we can display the result of the add to function using the variable. So let's use a print. put in our add to variable. Then we want to put in our arguments, and let's just put in 100 and 100. Select the code, F9 to run, and we get 200. Okay, so just a quick recap. We defined our function, we defined our variable, we assigned that function to that variable, and then we use the variable to call our function and input our arguments, and then display the answer over here. Okay? Next, let's go over some variables related to classes. In this example, we're going to go over a class variable and an instance variable. Let's create a class and call it dog. And this will be the class variable. We'll name it dog type and assign a string of type dog. And this class variable should be the same for all instances of this class that we'll create later. Next, let's create an init that will allow us to put in different names for the different dogs or instances. Def underscore init. Put in self. And as I mentioned before, we'll go over all of these, like the for loop and the functions and classes in detail in future tutorials. Self.name equals name. So we have our class, we have our class variable, and this is an init that will allow us to create our instance variables that we'll declare in just a minute. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create our first instance variable. We'll call this dog1. We'll use our class init to assign the name of the dog. And let's name our first dog Sparky the dog. And let's create our second instance assigned to variable dog2, dog2. And let's name this dog Charlie the dog. Now let's create a print to display dog1 with its class variable of dog type and its instance variable with its name. And you can see that the class variable of dog type should be the same for instance or dog1 and instance or dog2. But the instance variable will change depending on each unique dog. Okay, so let's display dog1. We'll put in the dog type and the dog name. Let's copy this and do the same for dog2. So we could just change this to dog2. And let's select all this code, try and run it. Function F9, see what we get. Okay, so you can see our outputs here. This is dog1 with the class variable, which is the dog type of dog. And the instance variable, which is the name, in this case, is Sparky the dog. And then we have dog2, where the class variable, again, the dog type stays the same, the class variable stays the same. And the instance variable, which in this case, or this example, you can think of as the name, changes and is unique to each dog. Okay, so that's an example of how you use class variables and instance variables with classes. Before we move on, a quick note. Another topic related to variables and classes are getters and setters, sometimes called mutators. And these are used to control changes to variables. We will cover this topic in a future tutorial. So now let's show you how to insert variables into a string. Let's create three variables, variable 1, variable 2, and variable 3, and assign three values, 1, 2, and 3. Now let's use a print to display A, B, C, easy as, and we're going to put in three sets of curly brackets as placeholders. Close the string. Use a dot accessor for format, and then put on our variables, variable 1, 2, and 3. So what this does is we have a string, and then we have three sets of curly brackets, and each set of curly brackets corresponds to the variable here in the format. So variable 1, which is 1, variable 2, which is 2, variable 3, which is 3, should each be placed in these sets of curly brackets here. Select and run, and you can see here in our output we get A, B, C, easy as 1, 2, 3. So that's one way to insert variables into strings. Let's copy this and show you another way. In this example, we're not going to use the format, and instead of the curly brackets, we're going to use %s as placeholders for these variables. So let's put in %s, 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 and then after the close quote, we want to put in a %, and then in parens, we want to put in variable 1, variable 2, and variable 3, and then close out the last paren there. Let's try and run this and see what we get. Actually, let's just run it all at the same time again. Okay, so here we have both print statements with two different ways to insert the variables into the string, one with the curly brackets, one with the %s. Notice that the syntax for the curly brackets uses the format, and the syntax with the %s, after the last part of the string is closed, you put a %, and then in parens you put your variables, and you can see you get the same output for both. Just two different ways to do the same thing. Okay, last but not least, we want to show you how you can see the types for some different variables. So we're going to use a whole bunch of prints to display, and let's start with, this is actually a function. So in this case, we're showing you how to use the type to show the different types of functions and variables. Let's print this out, and you can see that this is a built-in function or method. Next, let's show you how to see the type for a string variable, and let's just say this is hello. And obviously this should return a string, and you can see it does, str for string. Let's just type out a bunch of these and then print them out all at the same time. Next, let's see, we want to see the type for 3, which should be an int. We want to see the type for 3.14, which should be a float. Next, we want to see the type for true, which should be bool, or boolean. And in this case, let's import a library, and we want to see the type for that library. Okay, so slightly off topic, but still somewhat related because you can see the types for variables as well. Let's print all this out and see what we get for their types. Okay, so you can see that it returns the types for each of these functions or variables or modules and shows you how they are classified here. So this first one was a function or method, then a string, an int, a float, a bool, and a module. Okay, so that is it for variables in Python. We will be doing many more Python tutorials in the near future. Please join us for those, and we'll see you next time.